New Thought Media Network is pleased to present The Inclusive Church, Ideas and Resources for Leaders of Multicultural Ministries. The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Tuesdays at 12 noon Mountain Time. Join Tracy and her guests as they go deep and share practical tips and resources you can use in your ministry. And now let's explore the Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here, and yes, of course, I'm dancing to the music of the theme song or any other music I might be hearing in my head. Welcome, welcome. This is the Inclusive Church, and every week we spend a few minutes thinking about and talking about resources for leaders in multicultural ministries. And when I say multicultural ministries, I am, of course, talking about ministries that are multi-ethnic with people who are from different racial and ethnic groups, but I'm also talking about all the other ways we are different from one another that create cultural ideas, cultural expectations, and cultural barriers or missteps. Two things that I always try to remember at the beginning of every show, just in case you happen to be the one who is watching the show for the very first time. When I am using church, we are talking about the people, not a building. That a lot of times when people hear the word church, they think of a building with a steeple or a brick building or, a remodeled home or whatever where people meet, and the church is the building. But in this conversation, we are talking about the congregation. The people actually make up the church. And if we didn't know or remember that before 2020, after COVID began, we relearned and we were reminded that our churches are places where people gather in order to share spiritual principles, spiritual practice, and spiritual deepening. The other word that sometimes confuses people is leader. I'm always saying leaders in multi-ethnic spiritual communities or leaders in multicultural ministries. And sometimes people assume I'm talking about ministers. I surely hope every minister is a leader, but I am using leader in a much broader sense. Anyone who is teaching classes, anyone who is helping to create policy, anyone who is marketing a spiritual community, anyone who is volunteering in any way where they are leading others or responsible for outcomes. They are the leaders who I think are the most valuable people in any church or spiritual community. Take a breath, Tracy. Now, with all of that out of the way, I can be really excited about today's show. I have the opportunity to visit with Abigail Schairer. And if you are someone who's been watching the show, you're like, that name sounds familiar. Yes, it should, because Reverend Abigail was on the show a couple of months ago, 2 or 3 months ago. And in that show, like so many others, it's like, but wait, there's more. Let's talk about this and this and this. And we couldn't get it all in. And so we decided to come back, after a few weeks and take one of those topics that we were both excited about and dive into it a little more deeply. So today with Reverend Abigail Schairer, we'll be talking about how our language affects or represents the work that we are doing to be inclusive. So 3 things that I know, 3 random facts about Reverend Abigail Schairer. Reverend Abigail Schairer and I were both speakers at an event in 2018, and I had my talk all written. I had worked for 6 months on this talk because it was a really important talk. And then she spoke the night before. I was speaking the next morning. And in her talk, she really made me have to rewrite the whole opening of my talk. So I shared that. I share that to say or to explain that Abigail Schairer is a creative and amazing and very skilled speaker who not only gives you content, but scares all the other speakers who have to come behind her. Second random fact about Abigail Schairer. Obviously, if you watched the previous one, you know that she is a minister at a very strong community in Seattle. And number three, you may already know, many of you, that she is someone that people much older than she is go to for advice about how to create successful retreats that are successful for the people who attend and that are also financially successful. So those are 3 random facts about Abigail Schairer, and I'm going to bring her on in here.
Hello, Tracy.
Hi. Recently, just in the last month, I came across those talks from 2018. That's probably why it's in my mind, because I watched my talk and I just love, it's one of the best talks I've ever done. But part of that is because I redid the beginning, building on what had happened the night before.
I was incredibly complimented. I was like, oh, Tracy's talking about what I spoke about. It was so cool. It was so cool. It was a good synergy and a huge compliment. So thank you.
Well, and not to get totally distracted, but it was a synergy. But what you didn't know was that I was wrapping my talk around this quote about midwifing what wanted to be birthed and letting go of the stuff that was dead, hospicing what no longer serves us, and midwifing what was to be born. So when you started talking about the whole birth process and being pregnant with God, and like, what? Yeah, it was fun.
Oh, it's just the way that God works just never ceases to amaze me. It's so cool. It's just the greatest.
Yeah. Yes, it was great. And as the synchronicity around this topic. So today we're going to focus on changing our harmful language when we're leaders who are committed to be inclusive and to not just personally be inclusive, but to lead others in a journey toward being inclusive. Wow, there's so much to learn and so many things to pay attention to, but usually people only think about language when, at least the questions I get about language are almost always limited to, Tracy, tell me the exact word to call that group, that identity group of people. Like, is it Black, African, African American, Afro American, people of color? Like, tell me the right word to use. Or is it Hispanic or Chicano or Latino or Latinx? What is it? Like, other than that, people hardly ever talk about language. Maybe in the last couple of years, a lot of, about pronouns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yes, we do need to talk about pronouns, and but when we were talking before, I don't even remember exactly what we said, but you had this whole idea. So what are we going to dive into?
Well, I will let you know that I've been working on for years recognizing racist language.
Yes.
And a couple of years ago, we had this conversation on staff where our um, one of the staff members sent out a meme that they saw online that's talked about changing violent language. And both of those topics to me are so rich. We've committed on staff to call each other in when we notice any of the above, any racist or violent language, and have been using it as a practice to reframe and change our language so it's inclusive and loving. I mean, that's the point. I work at a Center for Spiritual Living Seattle, and our intention is to be inclusive, but that doesn't always mean that I catch it all the time. So I will say there's so many, I mean, even recent examples, but I'm just going to give a little list of examples. I will not do bullet points because bullet points are violent language.
Yes, I'm like, bullet. Wow, that's violent language, isn't it?
And deadline. It's so we've got instead of bullet point, it's just point. This is my point. These are the points I'm here to make. And instead of deadline, there's a timeline with a due date on it. Or perhaps you might say, I'm going to jump the gun. Or I just said recently, that's not the hill I'm going to die on. It's so amazing how many references are violent references. And it made me think about where did that come from? I don't want to die on any hill. People talk about somebody being a straight shooter. It's just, how about they know their mind, or they're very honest, they're very direct in how they approach things. How about instead of let's pull the trigger on this, why don't we just launch it or move forward? Or gosh, somebody might say with their interview, oh, I killed it,
Right.
Well, what so there's so many examples of violence that permeates at least my language, I've noticed, and I keep catching myself on it.
Yeah, we were on an email thread together with some other people, and you responded to their comment about, and the deadline is, and you responded, with, thanks for letting me know the submission date, or, the desired submission date. And I probably would not have I probably would not have caught that you made the shift, except that you did something that I want everyone to think about. So you shifted it because you're paying attention to violent language, but you also then, like, as in parentheses, or maybe in the next paragraph, but then you educated the rest of us on the thread. I am working to eliminate violent language from my own use, so I have changed deadline to submission date. And I think that's a key thing that we don't always do. Yes, our responsibility is it's my responsibility to do this if I choose. If I choose, I'm going to pay attention to my use of language. But as a leader, there are times when I also have a responsibility to educate others, because I would never have caught that.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you brought it to my attention, I was like, okay, that's a really interesting experiment for me to replace deadline. And I was just thinking of the one word deadline in so many things that I do, and just start practicing using different terminology. And then once I get comfortable doing it and can spot it, then I'll add the piece that you had, which was the education piece without judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm so grateful. So many people have called me in at times in my life, and they've showed me that occasionally I've used language that isn't supportive to my intention of being inclusive and anti-racist. Like, I was in a class and I told this whole story about like how I changed a belief I had. I had a belief that I couldn't grow plants, and so I told everybody how I had a black thumb, and then I reframed my belief, and now I have a green thumb. And then one of the students wrote me an email after the class and was like, "So, have you ever thought about that saying the term black thumb could be a racist term?" And I hadn't. And I had told that story so many times, and I was like, oh my gosh. But how grateful I was for that student who brought me in integrity with who I want to be in the world.
And some people would say that, oh, that's just overboard. It's just a phrase. And everybody knows what it means. It doesn't have anything to do with race. Well, one, go look up the origin of every phrase we have. And some of them did not originate from a negative racial bias. But the use of the word black does have a racial bias in American colloquialisms, even if it didn't really originate in slavery or something like that. However, when I was in high school or college, like, a gazillion years ago, I remember being so affected by Malcolm X, who wrote this whole long list of words that when he was in prison and was reading the dictionary and, looking up definitions of things, that how many terms that are meant and are used in a negative fashion. Black thumb, black sheep, right? In the black of night, as a danger. So either as a negative or representing danger. And I had, before reading that, I had not really realized how much in our language in the US had that around race. And so I have thought about this a lot over many decades. And still, there are just things in the language that most people don't ever consider. There could be an alternate way to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's blackballed. That definitely has racist roots. And then blacklist. So the blacklist is the interesting one. My wife works for Stanford University, and Stanford a few years ago went through she works in the technology area, and the programming on the back end was like, if somebody was not they were taken off a mailing list, they removed themselves, they were blacklisted, right? So they put them on the blacklist, and so Stanford had to actually change how the programming in the computers was written because it was just the default of what everybody said, how everybody did it, and they had to take a conscious effort to remove that as like, oh, this is the bad thing, is the blacklist. No.
Right. The people who will not be included, the people who don't make the mark, or even if people, remove themselves from the whitelist. And we do say, if you want to get our mail, please whitelist this email address. But it's like, oh, even if you chose it yourself, you're choosing to be on this list that we're going to ignore, etc. But yeah, there's so many things, and those are the ones that just have the words Black in them. When we talk about other things that have a connotation that is based on language, that has a connotation that is based on some cultural or ethnic or racially acculturated term. I had a reaction this past weekend, and I'm just taking a breath because I remember the phrase that was used and that I reacted to, but in this moment, I'm trying to remember exactly when it wasn't appropriate. That I remember that because I reacted really strongly internally. But it was someone saying that, oh, I wish I had brought some sage because it would be great if we also say, oh, I know what it was, but it would be great if we, walked through and saged this space. And for me, I have a reaction to that because of several things. One, using sage as a clearing is something that is from, Native American, Indian, and other indigenous cultures. It is a spiritual practice that is not just willy-nilly, oh, we're just going to burn some sage and clear out all the negative things. It's used in specific kinds of ceremony in specific ways. And we have co-opted it, especially in New Age and New Thought. And we just think, oh, we'll just use it to clear. And we just kind of walk around with the sage, or we have people, come in and we use the sage and just like, or at their bodies. And so I know I strongly react to that because once someone educated me and they told me all the, good detailed reasons, I don't remember any of those. I just remember, oh, if I'm ever going to use sage, remember to look up again how it should be used and if there are any specific blessings that are appropriate to use or inappropriate to use. So, don't just light up some sage and then start saying my own words. And so that happened just this weekend, and it's the practice, but it was the languaging of it too. Oh yeah, we should just sage the room. Well, you're not saging the space. You're using sage to accomplish some goal, right? To welcome in or to reveal spirit or to, right? It's not sage as a verb. We're just going to sage it because that's what we do. It's like, I won't use that language. And I failed 15 minutes ago to acknowledge that we've got Shay in the room, and thank you. I'm so glad to be back home after a fabulous conference, and Wayne is almost always with us, and I'm so glad that you are here. And then, yes, Anita, wouldn't whitelisting be just as racial as blacklist? It is. It is a racially charged term that we should not be using. We should be replacing with, these are the active subscribers, or these are the emails, these are the people with emails in my address book, right? Or this is the one that I tend to use more is who are my active subscribers, if it's like the newsletter. And Anita, I love that you asked that question in the chat, because just like there are a lot of words or terms that use Black to denote a negative or a deficiency, there are dozens of terms that use white to falsely denote purity, perfection, or better than. And I don't know, Abigail, but I'm betting we're both at the top of both of our lists is it's just a little white lie.
Oh gosh. It's not that.
It's okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
It's a lie. Okay, just say it's a lie.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you brought up the indigenous thing, because I find it really interesting. So I heard the word smudge. The word I don't use is smudge, and I do at the retreats I do use sage for an opportunity to clear off energy. And I've had that inquiry and the conversation. And the interesting thing is sometimes people of indigenous communities are great. The people I've talked to are great, as long as I'm not using the ceremonial practice that they are using, and I'm co-opting their ceremony, that I'm using it in a way that is my own, and I don't say it's a smudge blessing. I'm using just that it is a blessing and a clearing that I'm using. And it's interesting because I just had this conversation with my one of my colleagues who works part-time for us here at CSL Seattle. She also does museum design. And we were having this conversation about Native American versus Indian. So my history is I was born and raised in New Mexico, and there's so many Native American tribes there, or Indian tribes. I've changed my language to Native American because they were here first before those of us with white heritage came on board. That I am on their land. And I just found it really interesting that the Indian Pueblo Culture Center in New Mexico is still the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. So I was talking to my colleague, and she said that she was doing a museum that was featuring different Indian tribes, and the people that were the tribal people had used Indian as they actually were using that term. Like they were okay with the word Indian, even though the history of it is when people came that were not Native Americans, they thought they were coming to India. And so therefore those people who were living there were Indians. But that's kind of like the misconception of how that came about. Some of those tribes are okay with that terminology. And so it's interesting. I think it comes down to the same conversation that you were just bringing up. Do what do I call you? Do I call you Black? Do I call you African American? And it depends on the person, honestly, because people have their own experiences of their own identity.
Yeah, and that's actually whether we're talking about racial or any identity group name, or whether we're talking about pronouns or what, right? Ultimately, when you interact and engage with many different people, especially if they're in different parts of the country or the world, it is always respectful to ask people or to listen to how people refer to themselves. and adopt that when engaging with them, because there's not ever going to be just one term that is the term, right? So even, and that's not just with people of color or people who are not heterosexual. It is about any group, including white folks. So, right, sometimes I've gotten feedback if I say white folks, I'll have people say, well, I don't like, I'm not folksy. Like, right. And then I'll have somebody say, well, I don't, I'll say white folks, and they'll be like, they don't have a problem with folks, but they are like, I'm not white, I'm European American, right? Or, and just like everybody else, there will be people who are white or who identify as white who don't want to use the umbrella term, and they will say, I am of Irish heritage, and so I am Irish, or I am Irish American, or my great grandparents immigrated to the US from Europe or from France, right? And so I'm French American. So when you know individuals and you know their background, our language, our willingness to use the language that specifically describes them or uses the terms they use to describe themselves, actually, I think that's a lot easier because you're dealing with that individual or small group of people who you know.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge does come when any of us are talking about groups in general, and what overarching term we use. So while I have a strong dislike for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, I don't get mad when people use it because I know they most likely think they are doing a good job of being inclusive of, and everyone who is not white. And so I understand that, even though it's not a term that I personally choose to use. And if we were having a conversation and you were asking me, I would be like, please never use that in referring to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's a general term. And so we're always using language at both levels, the general level and the level specific to the people we're interacting with. And maybe I've had to get used to that because I've had to deal with it my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for people who have just always assumed they are part of the norm and they never had to use any of these terms for themselves or other groups, I understand it might be harder.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just acknowledging the person who's in front of me and using the language that supports them. And that's really how I can be respectful and loving. And I really acknowledge that that takes a little work on my own part. That's a commitment from me, because I love and care about you, that I'm willing to change how I say things in order to honor you. And and that's why I'm gonna not say black thumb anymore. Like, there is another, it's just because that's what I used in the past doesn't mean I'm going to use that again in the future. It means that I'm going to look at what language am I using and finding the language that is loving and inclusive. And that takes a constant willingness on my part, because I'm devoted to this work, to be constantly changing. And it's uncomfortable. I'm going to say, for me to be the ones changing is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. and I'm not perfect. I discover new little gems all the time of like, I was having a conversation with my one of my colleagues, and she said, "Oh, I noticed that this person was activated, and usually we use the words triggered, like, oh, I'm feeling triggered by that, all right." And all of a sudden she got reminded that triggered is a violent language, and so she started using the word activated. I don't know if there's another better word, but I was so inspired by that. I was like, oh, look, there's another thing I can do to change my language, is to really notice what it is I'm saying on a daily basis in all of those areas, whether I'm using the term for the person in front of me on whatever their ethnicity or their heritage or their gender identity, or even their sexual orientation and identity, and how they want to be termed, but then also generic overall, I guess not generic, but just overall, things that are embedded in the culture that I grew up in and I'm still in America, on how we use violent language and racist language to refer to terms. So it's a constant, it's constant for me. I just found out just today, because I wanted to research a couple of examples. I found out that brown bag is a racist term. I didn't even know that. So that's a new one. If you're going to use something that has to do with lunch, you could just say that you're going to do a lunch or a takeout, or you're going to bring your own meal, bring your own lunch, instead of use brown bag. And I know that people actually have physical bags that are brown, but it doesn't mean that the history of where it came from isn't racist. It actually, I found out that it is. So
yes, and there's so much really painful connect to that. Not only brown bag, which we now could call a craft bag, because with the capital K, not the brand Kraft like macaroni and cheese, but craft bags. And yes, if I'm carrying a lunch bag and it happens to be brown, and someone says, "Oh, that's Tracy's lunch in that brown, adjective brown bag that's on the table," but different from let's brown bag. Or I've worked with some clients who were like, "Oh, we're going to have a brown bag lunch and learn." Like, really? Could we just have a lunch and learn? Could we just have a bring your own lunch and learn? But in the in the Black community as well, right? If you were darker than the brown bag, then you were too dark. You had to be lighter than the brown bag in order to get a less strenuous or less demanding assignment. Right. And so the darker you were, but that was kind of the cutoff, the color of the brown bag. If you were darker than that, you're going to get the hardest work, the most strenuous work, the most demanding work, the most demeaning work. And then the lighter you were. And so the whole thing around colorism is wrapped in stories related to the brown bag as well. And all of, as I'm talking and as we're thinking about this together, it is a reminder for me that I don't expect everyone to know everything about every term. But it is interesting that once you start listening differently, there are a lot of phrases that could make you go, well, let me go look that up. What does that really mean? Or what was the origin of that phrase? And then we can choose. So the purpose of this conversation is not to give you, the full list of everything you should no longer say, but to inspire others to do what both of us are doing, paying more attention to language and considering, oh, what is the history of that? Or what is the implication of that?
Yeah. And also ideally foster a sense of curiosity. It's what, you know, when I said, "Oh, that's not the hill I'm going to die on," I was like, "Where did that come from? Why am I even using that? I don't want to have anybody die, or just even talk about dying in my everyday language. I'm just really not interested."
Yeah, especially when it's when you're talking about let's make a decision about what we're going to do for the fall generous givers event, right? You're doing something that is fun and it's proactive and you're building community, and then you've got 5 different opinions, and then to say, well, that's not a hill I'm gonna die on. Like, okay, I'm willing to go with the wisdom of the group, or I shared my idea, but I don't think we have to do it that way. I mean, there's so many other ways to make that point.
Yeah.
And so if someone asks you, Reverend Abigail, they've watched this conversation and they come up to you next week and they say, what does this have to do with inclusion at our church? Like, that just seems like a lot of unnecessary burden and conversation, and it doesn't have anything to do with our spiritual principles. How might we respond to them?
Well, I would say that one of our most active premises is that God is love. And when I'm tuned in to that, whether you call it a force or a permeation of love, that I make choices that are in alignment with love. And loving descriptions and loving words are ways to be inclusive, are ways to what I know is that violent language can be harmful to people. And I want to be a place where love shows up, not where harm shows up. And if that is our collective intention, then that means it's something that we get to pay attention to in our language, because our language, our words have power. And that's one of the main teachings that we talk about is our words have power. And if they have power, it could be a power that is beneficial or it could be a power that is detrimental. And I would really like my words to be in alignment with something that's beneficial. And I would invite them to consider that as well.
I love that, because that's what happens, right? People walk up to us and they ask us, they've been thinking about it, and they ask us when we're in the middle of something else, but it's like, oh, wait, let me take a breath and let me build a bridge between what I know, what we teach and what we talk about, whether it's in Science of Mind or Unity or UFBL, but in under the umbrella of New Thought, what are those universal spiritual principles that we have made a commitment to? And it's not about being quote unquote politically correct. It's about really using our language to represent verbally that inner knowing and alignment with spirit and spiritual principle. And of course, the language, how we say that might change every time we say it, but right, it's that mindset. And I think sometimes it feels like a really hard thing for me to do, because in my mind, it's like, how could you not see the link? Right. And then other times I find it really easy to do because it's so fully present in me.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think about that often. Like, how do I make this make sense from the perception or from the perspective of our spiritual teaching, our declaration of principles, our global vision, like the things that we say we are committed to,
Mm-hmm.
versus it's just Tracy and Abigail. Tracy and Abigail, like they're just taking this a little bit too far. Like that's just too much. So
Yeah.
we're winding down
Mm-hmm.
over the next 3 or 4 minutes. What have we not shared, or what do we want to reinforce?
I have a couple more terms I want to share. uh, uh, jump the gun, roll with the punches. Let's see, you dodged a bullet. So those are some that I was thinking about. I actually heard somebody say this: instead of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, feeding 2 birds with 1 scone. I actually heard somebody say that. I was like, what did you just say? They said, I'm feeding 2 birds with a scone. And I just thought that was really fun. And then regarding the native terms, recently my staff, somebody said, oh, let's get a couple of us and let's go have a powwow. And I'm like, I don't think we should do that. It's like, or I'm sending smoke signals over here. So those are some things that maybe we could look at not saying, and just changing the terminology so that it's supportive to what we're doing and honoring those around us too.
And doing that without any sense of guilt.
Yes, my mission. That's why I say the call. I forgot who the lady is who did the TED Talk on calling people in. Look it up, TED Talk, calling people in. Calling somebody in love versus like, you shouldn't do that, or you can't say that, or, that was wrong of you to say. Shaming and blaming doesn't work. It's not supportive. It's not helpful. But really inviting in to taking a stand for love and looking at doing things in alignment with being a beneficial presence in the world, like approaching it from that avenue versus telling somebody that they're wrong. That's really key in all of these conversations, I think. And it's a constant reminder for me.
I agree with you, because if the goal is to expand the love, if the goal is, as I often talk about all of the inclusion work, I do this because I want to model and see and experience the spiritual definition of unity and the spiritual definition of harmony and the spiritual definition of love being evidenced in the world I live in, not just for me personally, but as the cultural norm. And so, yes, I can correct you, but usually I'm going to do that in the context of, here's another way to look at that. Or are you aware that some people might find that offensive? Or do you know the history of that term? Right? Let's look up how the origin of that term. And then maybe me saying, yeah, I'm going to do my best not to use that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe we look it up together and then say, let's try to come up with 4 alternatives.
Yeah.
We're doing it together. And then, especially with more than one alternative, I'm not learning a script. I'm learning to think about it differently.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no shame, no blame, no guilt, because all of us learned all these colloquialisms and these terms and these adjectives because we live in a culture where they have been alive for centuries in most cases.
Yeah.
So how could you be blamed for that's what you've heard since you were 4 years old?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not 4 years old anymore. I can choose a different phrase or way to communicate.
Yes. Thank you for framing that in such a wonderful way. I really like how you put it. Thank you, Tracy.
And thank you for suggesting that we do a whole show just on this one piece, because both of us knew it's like, oh no, we can't even start that. That's a really good comment, but we need 45 minutes on that alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you, Abigail Schairer. And guess what?
What?
I bet you're going to have to come back again.
That would be fun.
But thank you for today, and we'll talk again real soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Tracy.
So everybody, I just want to remind you that we do this show, Inclusive Church, every Tuesday at noon Mountain Time. And I hope that you will join us as we explore what does it take to have an inclusive church community, and what are specific things we can talk about, think about, and do. Not just think about intellectually, but think about in terms of how we communicate, how we resolve conflict, and how we have the courage and compassion to collaborate on moving through differences to find unity, harmony, and love. My name is Tracy Brown, and I'll see you again soon.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.